Deep in the shadowed valleys of northwestern Connecticut, where three mountains lean together to block the sun, there exists a place that refuses to stay buried. The foundations have crumbled. The families have scattered. The forest has reclaimed what humanity once carved from its flesh. But the stories persist with the tenacity of weeds growing through concrete. This is Dudleytown. And if you ask the ghost hunters, the paranormal investigators, the thrill seekers who prowl Dark Entry Road after midnight, they will tell you this abandoned settlement is the most haunted place in America. They will tell you about a curse that stretches back 5 centuries. They will tell you about madness and murder, about families destroyed by forces beyond comprehension, about a darkness so profound that even the birds refuse to sing here. But what if everything you think you know about Dudleytown is a lie? What if the real story is darker still, not because of demons or hexes, but because of something far more ordinary, far more human, and infinitely more tragic? In 1993, actor Dan Aykroyd sat down for an interview with Playboy magazine. Among discussions of his films and his fascination with the paranormal, he made a striking declaration. He called Dudleytown the most haunted place on Earth. Never mind that he mistakenly placed it in Massachusetts instead of Connecticut. The damage was done. The legend was endorsed by a Hollywood star, someone who had brought ghost busting to the mainstream with a proton pack and a memorable jumpsuit. And if Dan Aykroyd believed it, well, maybe there was something to these whispers after all. But Aykroyd was late to the party. By the time he spoke those words, Dudleytown had already spent decades as a pilgrimage site for those who traffic in the supernatural. In the early 1970s, a couple from Monroe, Connecticut, made a Halloween special filmed in Dudleytown. Their names were Ed and Lorraine Warren, and if those names sound familiar, it is because they would go on to investigate the Amityville Horror, to inspire the Conjuring films, to become the most famous paranormal investigators America ever produced. When the Warrens stood in that dark Connecticut forest and declared Dudleytown to be demonically possessed, they were not speaking as skeptics or historians. They were speaking as believers, as people who saw evil lurking in cellar holes and heard whispers in the wind through dead leaves. Their proclamation carried weight in certain circles, and the legend grew teeth. Today, Dudleytown does not welcome visitors. The land is privately owned by the Dark Entry Forest Association, and they have made their position abundantly clear. No trespassing, no exceptions. Police patrol the area with the grim determination of people who have dealt with one too many midnight ghost hunters, trampling through private property with EMF detectors and voice recorders. The association has watched their forest become a destination for vandals and cultists, for people who leave behind beer cans and spray-painted pentagrams, for those who think abandoned places are playgrounds without consequences. The closure has only fed the legend. When you tell people they cannot go somewhere, that place becomes irresistible. The forbidden has always been more alluring than the accessible. But here is what the ghost hunters and the curse believers rarely mention. Here is what gets lost in the fog of legend and supernatural speculation. Dudleytown was never actually a town. It was never incorporated, never had official boundaries, never appeared on any municipal charter. It was a cluster of farms in a valley that the people of Cornwall, Connecticut, simply began calling by the name of the families who settled there. The Dudleys. A handful of brothers who bought rocky, shadowed land in the 1740s and tried to make it yield a living. That is what Dudleytown was. That is all it ever was. And yet somehow, that modest truth has been transformed into something else entirely. Somehow, a few failed farms in the Litchfield Hills became a vessel for our deepest fears about curses and evil, about places where the veil between worlds grows thin, about the possibility that some ground is simply wrong and will break anyone who tries to stand upon it. The question is not whether Dudleytown is haunted. The question is why we need it to be haunted, why we need its story to be about supernatural malevolence rather than the harder, colder truth of frontier failure. And perhaps most importantly, who benefits from keeping that legend alive? You think you know the story of Dudleytown. You have heard it before, in one form or another. It goes like this. In the year 1510, in the court of King Henry VII of England, there lived a nobleman named Edmund Dudley. He was an ambitious man, a lawyer, a financial advisor to the crown, someone who had climbed high and forgotten to watch his footing. When Henry VII died and his son became Henry VIII, the new king needed scapegoats. He needed someone to blame for his father's unpopular policies, for the heavy taxes and the aggressive collection of debts that had made the previous reign so despised. Edmund Dudley, along with his colleague Richard Empson, fit that need perfectly. On August 17, 1510, Edmund Dudley walked to Tower Hill and placed his head upon the block. The executioner's axe fell, and with it, according to legend, a curse was born. But Edmund Dudley was not the only member of his family to meet a grim fate. His son, John Dudley, rose even higher, becoming the Duke of Northumberland, becoming the most powerful man in England during the short reign of the boy king Edward VI. And John Dudley also reached too far. When Edward lay dying, John arranged for his own daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, to be named as heir instead of Henry VIII's daughters Mary and Elizabeth. It was a desperate gamble to maintain power, and it failed spectacularly. Lady Jane Grey reigned for 9 days before Mary seized the throne. John Dudley was arrested, convicted of treason, and on August 22nd, 1553, he too was beheaded. 2 generations, 2 executions, 2 severed heads. The legend would later point to this as proof of a curse already working its dark will through the Dudley bloodline. But the curse was not finished. According to the story, one of John Dudley's sons was Robert Dudley, who became the Earl of Leicester and the lifelong favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. Robert Dudley was a survivor. He danced at the edge of scandal his entire life, was suspected in the mysterious death of his first wife, was nearly named Elizabeth's heir, and died in his bed in 1588, one of the most powerful men in England. Not exactly cursed, but the legend is flexible on this point. Some versions claim Robert Dudley fled England for America. Others skip him entirely and jump to a man named William Dudley, who emigrated to Guilford, Connecticut in the 1630s as part of the Puritan migration. And it is here, in the New World, that the curse allegedly followed the Dudley name like a shadow. William Dudley's descendants, the story goes, eventually moved inland to the hills of northwestern Connecticut. 3 brothers, or maybe 4 or 5, depending on who is telling the story. Gideon Dudley, Barzillai Dudley, Abiel Dudley, and possibly Martin and Abijah. They settled in a valley overshadowed by Bald Mountain and Coltsfoot Mountain, where the sun barely reached, where the soil was thin and rocky, where the very air seemed to press down with a weight that had nothing to do with altitude. They built their homes, they cleared their fields, and the curse began its work. Abiel Dudley was among the first to feel it. He lost everything, his land, his money, his very sanity. He lived out his final years doing odd jobs for his neighbours, his mind unravelling thread by thread until he died at the age of 90, a raving shell of whatever he once had been. The townspeople whispered that he saw things in the woods, things that should not be seen, things that broke him from the inside out. Then, There was Nathaniel Carter, who bought Abiel Dudley's house and brought his family to live in Dudleytown in 1759. While Nathaniel was away on business, Native Americans raided his home, killing his wife and infant child and taking his other children captive. When he returned to find his family destroyed, he moved to Binghamton, New York, trying to escape. But you cannot outrun a curse. In his new home, another attack came. This time, Nathaniel himself was killed. The curse, it seemed, could follow you anywhere. In 1792, a man named Gershon Hollister was helping his neighbor William Tanner build a barn. Hollister fell from the roof and died instantly. The death was ruled an accident, but Tanner began to behave strangely afterward. He spoke of demons in the forest, of creatures that watched from the shadows. His mind deteriorated until he too was considered mad. In 1804, Sarah Fay One, wife of Revolutionary War General Heman Swift, was struck by lightning while standing on her porch. Her husband witnessed her death and descended into insanity, spending his final years raving about the darkness that lived in Dudleytown. And then there is the most famous victim of the Dudleytown curse, Mary Cheney, born in Dudleytown, who married the newspaperman and political figure Horace Greeley. In 1872, just 1 week before Greeley was to face Ulysses S. Grant in the presidential election, Mary hanged herself. Greeley lost the election in a landslide and died less than a month later, his spirit broken. Some say the curse killed them both, but the curse did not stop there. As the 19th century wore on, Dudleytown began to empty. Families fled. Some simply vanished, like the children of John Patrick Brophy, who disappeared into the forest and were never seen again. By the turn of the 20th century, only a handful of stubborn holdouts remained, and then came Dr. William Clark, a New York cancer specialist who bought 1,000 acres, including Dudleytown in the early 1900s. He built a summer home there, a retreat from the city. One day, he left on a brief business trip. When he returned, he found his wife laughing hysterically, her mind shattered. She claimed to have seen things while he was gone. Apparitions, demons. Clark took her back to New York, but the damage was done. She killed herself, and with her death, Dudleytown died too. No one has lived there since. This is the story you have heard. This is the Dudleytown curse as it has been told and retold, embellished and expanded, passed from campfire to campfire and website to website. It is a story of supernatural evil, of a bloodline doomed, of a place so dark that it breaks everyone who tries to live there. It is compelling, it is terrifying, and it is almost entirely false. To understand the real Dudleytown, we must first understand Connecticut in the 1700s, and specifically the corner of Connecticut where Dudleytown would emerge. The western lands of Connecticut, the region that would become Litchfield County, were among the last parts of the colony to be settled. It was not because the land was cursed. It was because the land was difficult. The terrain was mountainous. The soil was rocky and acidic. The growing season was short. These were not the fertile river valleys that had attracted earlier settlers. These were the leftovers, the places you went when everywhere else was taken. In 1731, the Connecticut General Assembly authorized the survey and sale of the western lands. The idea was simple: auction off townships to the highest bidders and use the proceeds to support schools in the more established towns. In 1738, at an auction in Fairfield, a township called Cornwall was sold. Settlement began that same year, and it was not an easy proposition. The men and women who came to Cornwall were not adventurers seeking fortune. They were families from eastern Connecticut looking for affordable land, people willing to work harder for less in exchange for a place to call their own. Thomas Griffiths was one of the first. He bought land in what would become known as Dudleytown around 1742. The land was in a valley ringed by hills, a place where the mountains blocked the sunlight for much of the day, where the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Griffiths did not care. He saw timber. The forests were thick, and timber meant fuel for the iron industry that was beginning to bloom in the region. Cornwall sat within the Salisbury district, one of the most productive iron-producing regions in colonial America. Blast furnaces needed charcoal, and charcoal meant cleared land. For a time, this made Dudleytown viable, if not prosperous. Then came the Dudleys. In 1747, Gideon Dudley purchased land from Griffiths. By 1753, his brothers Barzillai and Abiel had joined him, buying their own plots. Later, Martin Dudley arrived, though he was from a different line of the family, and married Gideon's daughter. These men were not noblemen. They were not even particularly notable. They were farmers and labourers, trying to carve a living from land that fought them every step of the way. It is important to understand that Dudleytown was never isolated in the way the legend suggests. It was part of Cornwall, fully integrated into the township. Residents paid taxes to Cornwall, attended church in Cornwall, participated in town meetings in Cornwall. They were not outcasts living in some forgotten pocket of darkness. They were farmers on difficult land, and difficult land was everywhere in New England. There was nothing special about Dudleytown's struggles except that later generations would decide there was. The peak population of the area that became known as Dudleytown was about 26 families, achieved sometime in the mid-1800s. That is it, 26 families scattered across a hillside, most of them barely scraping by. The census records show farmers growing flax, wheat, and corn, raising a few cattle and sheep, supplementing their income with timber work for the nearby charcoal producers. This was subsistence farming, the kind of life where one bad harvest meant hunger, where illness could devastate a family's fortunes, where accidents were common and often fatal. It was hard. It was brutal, but it was not unique. Hundreds of similar settlements existed across New England, and many of them also failed. By the 1850s, the writing was on the wall for Dudleytown and places like it. The iron industry in Connecticut was declining, unable to compete with the vast iron deposits being discovered in the Midwest. The charcoal industry that had sustained Dudleytown was collapsing. At the same time, the opening of the American frontier meant that families no longer had to break their backs on New England's rocky hills. You could go west to Ohio, to Illinois, to Iowa, where the soil was deep and black and practically begged to be farmed. The economic calculus was simple: stay in Dudleytown and struggle, or leave and prosper. Most people chose to leave. By the 1880s, Dudleytown was largely deserted. By the early 1900s, it was completely abandoned. The forest reclaimed the land, with the speed that always surprises people who have never watched nature take back what humans temporarily held. Stone foundations vanished beneath leaf mold and moss. Wells filled in. Roads became deer paths. And in that absence, in that silence, a space opened for legend to grow. Now let us examine the curse itself, the catalogue of horrors that supposedly befell Dudleytown. Let us look at each tragedy, each supposed victim of supernatural malevolence, and see what the historical record actually tells us. Abiel Dudley, the patriarch, is often described as the curse's first American victim. The legend says he lost his mind, that he died raving about demons in the forest. The truth is both simpler and sadder. Abiel Dudley lived to the age of 90, which in the 1700s was an extraordinary lifespan. As an old man, he developed dementia. His neighbors described him as distracted in his final years, which is 18th century language for senility. He did lose his property, but not to demons or curses. He lost it because he became unable to care for himself and was made a ward of the town, a common fate for elderly people in that era who had no family to support them. When Abiel died in 1799, the town sold his property to cover the costs of his care. There is nothing supernatural about any of this. It is simply what happened to old people who lived too long and had no one left. Nathaniel Carter bought Abiel's property and moved his family there in 1759. 4 years later, in 1763, while Nathaniel was away, a Native American raid killed his wife and infant child and took his other children captive. This is true. This happened. And it is a horror beyond imagining, the kind of tragedy that would break anyone. But was it a curse? Or was it the brutal reality of frontier life in 1763, when the French and Indian War had only just ended, when raids on frontier settlements were common throughout New England? Nathaniel Carter moved to Binghamton, New York, and was later killed there. Again, this is true. But Binghamton was also on the frontier, also subject to raids and violence. The curse believers want you to think the darkness followed him. The historical record suggests he simply moved from one dangerous place to another dangerous place, and his luck ran out twice. Gershon Hollister died in 1792 while helping William Tanner build a barn. The records describe it as a fall from the roof, a construction accident. The legend says Tanner murdered him and then went mad from guilt. Here is what we actually know. Hollister fell and died. There was an investigation, as there always was with unexpected deaths. Tanner was not charged with anything. No evidence of murder was found. As for Tanner's supposed descent into madness, the only source for this is the legend itself. Town records show Tanner continued to live and work in the area for years after Hollister's death, which does not sound like a man driven insane by demons or guilt. Construction accidents were common in the 1700s. Farming was dangerous work. Barn building was dangerous work. People fell, people died, and no supernatural explanation was required. Sarah Fay I, wife of General Heman Swift, was killed by lightning in 1804. The legend claims this drove her husband insane. Let us be clear about what actually happened. Sarah was struck by lightning during a storm. This is documented. It was a freak accident, the kind of random tragedy that reinforced people's belief in an arbitrary God. As for General Swift going mad afterward, there is no evidence for this claim in any contemporary document. Swift was a Revolutionary War veteran, a respected member of the community, and he lived for years after his wife's death without any recorded incidents of madness or strange behavior. The curse. Believers have taken a tragic accident and invented a second tragedy to go with it. And now, we come to Mary Cheney Greeley, perhaps the most repeated element of the Dudleytown curse, and one of the most thoroughly debunked. The legend claims that Mary Cheney was born in Dudleytown, that she carried the curse with her when she married the famous newspaperman and politician Horace Greeley, and that she hanged herself 1 week before the 1872 presidential election, contributing to her husband's devastating loss and subsequent death. This story is repeated on dozens of websites, in multiple books about haunted places, on countless YouTube videos about Dudleytown. It has the ring of tragic truth. It is also completely false. Mary Cheney was not born in Dudleytown. She was born in Litchfield, Connecticut, several miles south of Cornwall. Birth records confirm this. She never lived in Dudleytown. There is no documentary evidence connecting her to the place at all, and she did not hang herself. Mary Cheney Greeley died on October 30th, 1872, from complications of tuberculosis, a respiratory disease she had suffered from for 20 years. She was chronically ill for much of her adult life, not cursed. Her death occurred during her husband's presidential campaign, which is true, and Horace Greeley did die less than a month later on November 29. But Greeley did not die of grief or a broken heart or any curse. He died after suffering a complete mental and physical collapse brought on by months of brutal campaigning, the loss of the election, severe financial problems, and his wife's long-expected death. His doctors diagnosed severe anxiety and insomnia, what we would now probably recognize as a nervous breakdown and clinical depression. Greeley was sent to a sanitarium in upstate New York and died there, his body and mind exhausted. This is tragic. This is real. But it has nothing to do with Dudleytown because Mary Cheney had nothing to do with Dudleytown. The Brophy family appears in multiple versions of the curse legend. The details vary, but the general story is that John Patrick Brophy moved to Dudleytown late in its history, that his wife died of tuberculosis, that his children vanished into the forest, that his house burned down, and that he himself wandered away and was never seen again. Some versions claim his wife went mad. Some claim his sons were swallowed by the woods. What do we actually know? John Brophy did live in the area in the late 1800s. His wife did die, likely from tuberculosis, which was epidemic in the 19th century and had nothing to do with curses. His house did burn, which was a common occurrence in an era of wood structures heated by open fires. As for his children vanishing, and Brophy himself disappearing into the forest, these elements appear to be pure invention, stories told to fill in the gaps when the real history was not dramatic enough. And finally, Dr. William Clark. Clark was a prominent New York physician and cancer specialist. He did purchase about 1,000 acres in Cornwall in the early 1900s, land that included part of what had been Dudleytown. He built a summer home there. And according to the legend, when he returned from a business trip, he found his wife had gone insane, driven mad by the demons and apparitions she encountered while alone. She later killed herself. This story is repeated everywhere, and like the Mary Cheney story, it is false. Clark's wife did not go insane. She did not kill herself. In fact, Clark and his wife spent many happy summers at their Cornwall property. Clark was known in Cornwall as a generous and civic-minded individual who contributed to local causes. The story of his wife's madness appears to have been invented wholesale, probably sometime in the mid-20th century, when the Dudleytown legend was taking its modern shape. This is what happens when you actually investigate the Dudleytown curse. Tragedy after tragedy collapses under examination. Real deaths get attributed to supernatural causes when natural causes are documented. Invented deaths are added to the list to make the curse seem more pervasive. People who never lived in Dudleytown become residents. People who died of documented diseases become victims of demons. And a pattern emerges, not of a curse, but of storytelling, of the way legends grow when they are useful, when they serve a purpose, when they give meaning to places that would otherwise be forgotten. But perhaps the biggest lie of the Dudleytown curse, the foundational deception upon which everything else is built, is the claim that the Dudley family of Connecticut were descendants of the cursed English nobleman, Edmund Dudley. This genealogical connection is essential to the legend. Without it, there is no curse to follow the family to America. Without it, Dudleytown is just another failed farming settlement. So where did this connection come from? And more importantly, is it true? The answer is no. It is completely demonstrably, thoroughly false. And we have known it was false for decades, yet the legend persists because the truth is less interesting than the lie. William Dudley arrived in Guilford, Connecticut in 1639 as part of the Puritan Great Migration. He came from Surrey, England, specifically from the towns of Dorking and Ockley. He married Jane Luitman, also from Surrey, in 1636, and they made the crossing together. William was a farmer, possibly a wheelwright, a man of modest means trying to make a better life in the New World. He was not nobility. He was not related to any nobility. And most importantly, he was absolutely not descended from Edmund Dudley, the executed minister of Henry VII. So where did the false connection come from? The error appears to have originated in 19th century genealogical work, when researchers, working without access to English parish records and making assumptions based on surnames alone, claimed that William Dudley must be descended from the Dudley lords because he shared their name. This was sloppy work, the kind of genealogy that connects people based on wishful thinking rather than documentation. But once it was published, it spread. It appeared in family histories. It was repeated in local Connecticut chronicles. And by the time anyone bothered to actually check the English records, the damage was done. Modern genealogical research, conducted in the early 2000s by Martin Hollick and published in the American Genealogist, definitively established that William Dudley of Guilford was the son of William Dudley and Eleanor Gooder of Dorking, Surrey. Parish records, wills, and other documents make this clear. There is no connection whatsoever to the noble Dudley family. None. The Dudleys of Dudleytown were descended from farmers and craftsmen, not from executed ministers and scheming dukes. Even if we ignore the genealogical impossibility for a moment, the legend still does not make sense. According to the curse story, the line goes from Edmund Dudley to his son John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to John's son Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and then somehow to America. But Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, had only 2 acknowledged sons. One died as a child. The other, also named Robert, went to Italy, and all of his children remained there. None of them came to America. There is no plausible link from the Earl of Leicester to William Dudley of Connecticut. The genealogy does not work. It never worked. It was always fiction. And yet, the curse legend requires this connection. Remove it, and the entire supernatural framework collapses. The Dudleys of Connecticut become what they always were: ordinary English settlers with no connection to Tudor intrigue. Dudleytown becomes what it always was: a failed farming settlement with no supernatural significance whatsoever. But admitting this would mean admitting that the legend is hollow, that there never was a curse, that all the madness and tragedy attributed to dark forces were simply the normal hardships of frontier life. And some people cannot accept that. So the false genealogy persists, repeated on website after website, included in book after book, despite the fact that genealogists debunked it years ago. Reverend Gary P. Dudley, himself a descendant of the Connecticut Dudleys, spent years researching his family history and wrote extensively about the Dudleytown legend. His conclusion was unequivocal. There is no genealogical connection to Edmund Dudley. There is no curse. The tragedies attributed to Dudleytown are either invented, exaggerated, or misattributed. But Reverend Dudley's careful research, published and available, has done little to slow the spread of the legend. Because people do not want the truth. They want the ghost story. If the Dudleytown curse is fiction, if the tragedies are either invented or misunderstood, if the genealogy is false, then where did the legend come from? Who created it, and when, and why? The answer is surprisingly recent. The Dudleytown curse, as we know it today, appears to have emerged in the 1940s and fully taken shape in the 1970s. Before that, Dudleytown was simply one of many abandoned settlements in rural Connecticut, unremarkable and mostly forgotten. The earliest hints of supernatural stories about Dudleytown appear in the 1930s and 40s, when the land had been owned by private individuals as summer property for several decades. Local teenagers began to tell each other stories about the deserted settlement, the way teenagers always do about abandoned places. These early stories were vague, more about the spooky atmosphere than any specific curse. But they laid the groundwork. The legend appears to have crystallized in a 1949 book called Strange New England by Austin Stevens. This volume collected various tales of odd happenings throughout the region, and it included a chapter on Dudleytown that mentioned some of the basic elements of the curse story. But Stevens' account was relatively restrained compared to what would come later. He noted that the settlement had been abandoned, that some residents had met tragic ends, but he presented these as curiosities rather than proof of supernatural activity. The legend truly exploded in the 1960s and 70s, and two factors were primarily responsible. The first was the rise of interest in the paranormal following the publication of books like The Amityville Horror and the success of films dealing with supernatural themes. Americans were newly fascinated by haunted houses, demonic possession, and the idea that places could be inherently evil. Dudleytown fit perfectly into this cultural moment. The second factor was Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens, self-described demonologists from Monroe, Connecticut, had been investigating paranormal claims since the early 1950s, but they really came to prominence in the 1970s with their involvement in high-profile cases like Amityville. In the early 1970s, the Warrens filmed a Halloween special at Dudleytown and declared it to be demonically possessed. This was not a casual opinion. When Ed Warren said a place was demonically possessed, he meant that malevolent entities, actual demons, had claimed that ground and were actively working evil there. The Warrens brought their considerable reputation to bear on Dudleytown, and their endorsement transformed the place in the public imagination. It is worth noting that the Warrens' methods and claims have been heavily criticized by skeptics and even by other paranormal investigators. Many of the cases they investigated, including Amityville, have been exposed as hoaxes or greatly exaggerated. The Warrens operated from a deeply Catholic worldview that saw demonic activity everywhere, and they had financial incentives to find hauntings, as their books and lectures were how they made their living. They were true believers, but they were also showmen, and Dudleytown was good for business. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the legend continued to grow through repetition. It appeared in books about Connecticut hauntings, in collections of American ghost stories, on local television programs about the paranormal. Each retelling added new details, embellished old ones, and moved further from whatever kernel of truth might have existed. The story became less about actual history and more about creating the most compelling narrative. If Mary Cheney Greeley did not actually hang herself in Dudleytown, well, maybe she should have in the story, because that makes the legend better. If William Clark's wife did not actually go insane, maybe she did in the legend, because that gives us a 20th century tragedy to prove the curse is still active. By the 1990s, Dudleytown had achieved the status it holds today. It was on every list of the most haunted places in America. It was featured in documentaries. It became a destination for paranormal investigators, equipped with electromagnetic field detectors and spirit boxes, tools of questionable scientific validity used to find evidence of ghosts. And then, in 1999, The Blair Witch Project was released, a film about students who vanish while investigating a legend in a haunted forest. The movie was a cultural phenomenon, and it sent people streaming to every abandoned, supposedly haunted location they could find. Dudleytown saw a massive surge in trespassers, vandals, and people convinced they were going to record proof of the supernatural. This influx of visitors created serious problems. The Dark Entry Forest Association, which owned the land, found themselves dealing with constant trespassing, property damage, graffiti, litter, and people conducting unauthorized ceremonies and rituals. The local police began aggressively patrolling the area. Cornwall residents, tired of ghost hunters flooding their quiet town, became hostile to anyone asking about Dudleytown. The association closed the land completely to the public. And that is where things stand today. You cannot legally visit Dudleytown. Signs warn that trespassers will be prosecuted. But this has not killed the legend. If anything, making Dudleytown forbidden has made it more attractive. The question remains, why do we need Dudleytown to be cursed? Why do we need places like it? What human need does the legend of the haunted, evil place serve? The answer may lie in our fundamental discomfort with randomness. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved to find causes, to see connections, to create narratives that make sense of the world. When bad things happen, especially when they happen in clusters, our brains demand an explanation. If a town experiences multiple tragedies, there must be a reason. If families fail, if people die, if a community withers and disappears, there must be something causing it beyond simple bad luck or poor agricultural conditions. Supernatural explanations provide that framework. A curse offers clarity. It says, these bad things happen not because life is random and brutal, and sometimes you just draw the short straw, but because dark forces are at work. This is actually comforting in a perverse way. A curse can be understood. It has rules, has origins, has logic, even if that logic is supernatural. A curse means the universe is not random. It means there are forces at work, even malevolent ones, and that is easier to accept than chaos. Dudleytown is hardly unique in American folklore. There are dozens of supposedly cursed places scattered across the country. The Myrtles Plantation in Louisiana, the allegedly most haunted house in America. The Winchester Mystery House in California, built according to the instructions of spirits to confuse ghosts. The Shanghai Tunnels in Portland, Oregon, where according to legend, thousands of men were abducted into slavery. These places share common features. They are old. They are associated with tragedy. They have some element of the exotic or the unusual that makes them stand out. And they all serve the same function. They give us places to direct our fear, to concentrate our anxiety about death and evil and the things we cannot control. What is interesting about Dudleytown specifically is how the legend has evolved to incorporate modern paranormal beliefs. The original stories were vague about what was wrong with the place. It was simply unlucky, perhaps inhabited by ghosts. But as demonology and paranormal investigation became more popular, Dudleytown's legend evolved to match. Now it is not just haunted, it is demonically possessed. It is not just unlucky, it is a vortex of negative energy. The legend has adapted to stay relevant to contemporary beliefs about the supernatural, just as all legends do. There is also an element of rebellion in the fascination with Dudleytown. In a world that has been mapped and measured and explained, where satellite images have removed the mystery from geography, places like Dudleytown offer a glimpse of the unknown. They are places where, supposedly, the rules break down, where science cannot explain what happens, where the modern rational world gives way to something older and darker. For people who feel constrained by rationality, by the mundane predictability of everyday life, Dudleytown represents possibility. It represents the idea that there might be more to existence than what we can see and measure. And finally, there is the attraction of transgression. Dudleytown is forbidden. You are not supposed to go there. Signs tell you to stay away. Police will arrest you if they catch you. And for a certain kind of person, that makes Dudleytown irresistible. The thrill is not just in experiencing a supposedly haunted place. The thrill is in defying authority, in going where you are not allowed, in claiming your right to access spaces that have been closed off. This is dark tourism at its most basic, the desire to visit places associated with death and suffering, but with the added spice of forbidden access. Today, if you drive to Cornwall, Connecticut, and try to find Dudleytown, you will be disappointed. The town does not advertise its location. Locals will not give you directions, will in fact actively discourage you from looking. The Cornwall police have made clear that anyone caught trespassing on Dark Entry forest property will be arrested and prosecuted. The landowners have dealt with too many ghost hunters, too many vandals, too many people who think private property does not apply to them because they have read about a curse on the internet. But assume you somehow found access. Assume you made it past the locked gates and the no trespassing signs and hiked into the Dark Entry forest. What would you find? Stone foundations mostly, cellar holes filled with leaves and rainwater, tumbled walls running through the woods, the kind of thing you can find in forests all over New England. Reminders that once this was farmland, once people lived here. The forest is thick, the valley is shadowed. If you went at the right time of year, in autumn when the leaves are changing and the light comes at low angles, you might feel a certain atmosphere, a sense of melancholy or isolation. But would you feel evil? Would you sense a curse? Would you experience the oppressive darkness, the strange silence, the feeling of being watched that so many accounts describe? Maybe. Our minds are powerful things, and expectation shapes experience. If you go to Dudleytown believing it is haunted, believing it is cursed, believing that you are walking on ground where demons dwell, then you will interpret everything through that lens. A sudden chill becomes supernatural. A snapping branch becomes a sign. The natural unease of being alone in the woods becomes confirmation of malevolence. Or maybe you would just find an abandoned settlement like hundreds of others, returning to forest after humanity briefly tried and failed to tame it. Maybe you would see Dudleytown not as cursed, but as poignant, a testament to the hubris of trying to farm land that should never have been farmed, to the grinding poverty of frontier life, to the way economics and geography doom some places from the start. The vandalism and illegal activity that plagued Dudleytown through the 1990s and early 2000s have left their own marks. Graffiti on stones, beer cans in cellar holes, the scars of people who thought abandoned places were theirs to desecrate. The Dark Entry Forest Association has worked to remove the damage and let the forest heal, but the legacy remains. Ironically, the people who came to Dudleytown seeking ghosts and demons caused more harm than any supposed curse ever did. There is a broader question about dark tourism that Dudleytown raises. What is the ethics of treating tragedy as entertainment? Even if the specific stories are false, Dudleytown represents real hardship. Real people struggled and failed there. Real families saw their dreams die in rocky soil and short growing seasons. Is it respectful to those people to turn their failure into a ghost story, to use their pain as the backdrop for thrill-seeking and paranormal investigation? This is not a question with an easy answer. On one hand, folklore and legend are how cultures process tragedy, how we make meaning from suffering. The ghost story is an ancient form, and transforming real events into supernatural tales is something humans have done for millennia. On the other hand, there is something unseemly about the commodification of tragedy, about the way places like Dudleytown become products to be consumed by people seeking a spooky experience. The Dark Entry Forest Association, to their credit, has tried to preserve Dudleytown not as a haunted attraction, but as a nature preserve. They maintain the land, allow the forest to reclaim what was briefly cleared, and keep people out not just to prevent vandalism, but to let the place rest. There is dignity in that approach, a recognition that some places are better left to time and trees than to ghost hunters and thrill seekers. But the legend will not die. It cannot die, because it serves too many purposes. It gives Cornwall a claim to fame, even if the town would prefer a different kind of recognition. It provides content for paranormal investigators, for YouTube channels, for blogs and podcasts about haunted America. It offers a local mystery, a story to tell newcomers, a piece of folklore that makes a place feel more interesting, more storied, more connected to the dark currents of history. As long as those needs exist, the Dudleytown curse will persist, no matter how thoroughly it has been debunked. So what is the truth about Dudleytown? What are we left with when we strip away the curse, the demons, the supernatural explanations? We are left with a story about land, about the American impulse to settle every available piece of ground, regardless of whether that ground could sustain settlement. About the hubris of thinking you can make a farm anywhere if you work hard enough, and the painful education that comes when the land proves you wrong. Dudleytown failed not because of a curse, but because it should never have been settled in the first place. The soil was poor. The growing season was too short. The location was too isolated. The economic conditions that briefly made it viable. The charcoal industry serving the iron furnaces were always going to collapse once iron production moved to places with easier access to ore and fuel. We are left with a story about mortality and mental illness. About Abiel Dudley, who lived to 90 and developed dementia, dying without resources in an era that had no social safety net. About people like Nathaniel Carter, who experienced trauma that no human should have to endure, and whose tragedy had nothing to do with supernatural forces and everything to do with the violence of colonial expansion. About the casual way frontier life killed people through accidents and disease and deprivation, and how easy it is, generations later, to misinterpret that constant attrition as evidence of a curse. We are left with a story about how legends are made, about how a few real tragedies get mixed with invented ones, how genealogical errors get repeated until they become accepted fact, how paranormal investigators and curse believers shape narratives to fit their worldview, how the absence of information gets filled with speculation, and that speculation hardens into certainty. The Dudleytown curse is a case study in how folklore operates in the modern world, how stories spread not through oral tradition, but through books and television and the internet, accumulating details as they go until the legend becomes far more elaborate than anything that actually happened. And finally, we are left with a story about what we want from the past and from places. We want meaning. We want significance. We do not want to believe that people struggled and suffered and died for nothing, that their communities failed without any grand reason, that history is often just a series of small disasters accumulating until a place is no longer viable. Supernatural curses give us that meaning, even if it is dark meaning. They tell us that Dudleytown matters, that it is special, that the forest that now covers those cellar holes hides something more than just the ordinary tragedy of failed dreams. But maybe the ordinary tragedy is enough. Maybe there is something profound in recognizing that Dudleytown was just a place where people tried to make a life and could not, where the land defeated them not through supernatural malevolence, but through simple, implacable fact. That is its own kind of horror, colder and more real than any demon. It is the horror of understanding that sometimes there is no curse, no grand design, no hidden evil. Sometimes you just pick the wrong valley, the wrong hillside, the wrong century, and the forest comes back and swallows what you built. And in time, no one remembers you were ever there at all. Except we do remember Dudleytown, not for what it was, but for what we have made it. The town that refused to die, not because of any supernatural resilience, but because we need places like Dudleytown, need them to carry our fears and our fascination with darkness, need them to be cursed, so we do not have to face the far bleaker possibility that the universe is random and our failures mean nothing at all. If you enjoyed uncovering the truth behind this American legend, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into folklore and the hidden history behind the stories we tell ourselves. The past is rarely what we think it is, and I will be here to keep pulling back the veil.